I've got to tell you folks, today is a good day.
Watch it in slow motion as you turn around and say,
nice.
I just thought I would enter the video a little bit differently today because it'll make me look really cool. Anyway, welcome back to 12 days of Amiga, ranking worst to best. And today is a really good day because since I broke my wrist due to, not that skateboard, but a skateboard, 2 months ago now, I have been obviously gradually doing self-rehabilitation. And one of the things that I noticed today is that after much effort and so forth, I can now begin to turn my hand over. Now, you see that? Yeah, you can do that, no trouble at all, probably. But this hand, I've only been able to get to sort of like 90 degrees, shall we say. But after a lot of stretching and persistence, my hand now goes over. So now I can do this. And everybody knows that when you can do that, the possibilities are endless. But anyway, jokes aside, that's a big improvement. Yeah, just wanted to share that with you. Completely irrelevant to the video, but it's looking fairly positive, I think, on the old wrist front. Anyway, that's not why you're here. What you are here for, though, is 12 days of Amiga, ranking worst to best. And I do want to quickly apologise. I did want to riff on the 12 days of Christmas thing with this series, but I have to say that thinking through all of this and researching bits and pieces of it has taken me longer than expected, and I've really needed to consider the next 3 positions, including today's, very carefully. And I've gone backwards and forwards in my own mind about what is the right system to put in here, and I'm sure some people are going to agree with me, some people are going to disagree with me, but that's the whole point of me doing this, is to stimulate some good conversation and so forth. That's what this is all about. And so I finally decided, and yeah, if you want to find out how I'm ranking all of the systems, all of the Amigas that I've talked about so far and those yet to come, have a look in the video description. Anyway, without further ado, today I'm unveiling number 6, and it is the Amiga 2000. Feels like I've talked about this one enough already. But let's see what I can talk about, because I've got a few little tidbits which I think you might find interesting. So anyway, what is the Amiga 2000? Well, it's actually is this. And for once, I'm not lying. I really haven't photoshopped this. This is an Amiga 2000. First announced in March of 1987 by Commodore, alongside, or just slightly before the Amiga 500. Actually, let's get it right. Just slightly before the Amiga 500. And this was Commodore's big box, that means big desktop case, successor to the original Amiga 1000 that was launched in July of 1985. So, I don't want to go too much over the Amiga 1000, because I'll cover that in its own video. But the Amiga 1000 was the very first Amiga, as I just said, and it was a desktop case system, slim profile, very limited expansion potential. So there was very limited ability to put official upgrade cards inside of the machine. There was a small RAM card that could go on the front of the machine, and a side expansion port. And if you're wondering what that looked like, well, it was basically the Amiga 500's edge connector, but the other way around. So it means that if you put Amiga 500 peripherals on it, they tend to be upside down and backwards. But anyway, so that was the extent of the Amiga 1000's expansion. So Commodore recognised that this needed to be rectified, and so they set about obviously developing the successor to the original Amiga. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting, because the original Amiga team had already started to sort of disband and so forth as Commodore started to cut costs and so forth to try and stay afloat, because they weren't really shipping any Amigas in any real volume until about September of 1985. And the Los Gatos team, which was basically the remnants of the original Amiga team, said to Commodore that we need to keep on pushing this technology forwards, and essentially proposed a system or a specification known as Ranger. And this became a bit of a catch-all for all sorts of ideas for how the Amiga could be moved forwards, and over the years we've seen various sort of case designs or mock-ups of proposed airflow solutions and so forth for the system, as well as specifications. But alongside what was left of the original Amiga team in Los Gatos and their Ranger specification, in West Germany, another Commodore subsidiary, Commodore West Germany one would assume, basically proposed an alternative solution, and it's essentially what the Amiga 2000 became. And what it was essentially an Amiga 1000 but extended with expansion slots, taking on a design that was specified in the original Amiga's hardware reference manual. And so this would mean that this potential system would have the ability to take internal expansion cards, a bit like an ISA or a PCI card that you would have in a PC, or a NuBus card in an older Apple Macintosh. And these could be anything: hard disk controllers, RAM cards, Genlock devices, all sorts of things. Well, yeah, maybe not Genlocks, we'll get onto that in a little bit. But the idea was that this would allow an Amiga to be expandable internally. And so, yes, the West German design won out, and so the Amiga 2000, as you see here, development proceeded instead of Ranger, which is a bit of a shame because Jay Miner, that was still heading up what was left of the Los Gatos team, said that he had pretty much finished designing the Ranger chipset, which was going to be a mild update to OCS, but an update nonetheless that would allow things like 128 colours on screen, for example, and move the graphics memory away from being chip RAM into video RAM, VRAM, which is quite important because in March 1987, two other systems that used VRAM came onto the scene at the same time that the original Amiga 2000 was launched. So the West German team basically set about creating what we now know as the Amiga 2000, with 5 so-called Zorro 2 expansion slots, 4 ISA slots, and something called a video slot, more on that in a little bit, and something that they curiously called an MMU slot at the time. And this was basically the CPU socket, which was nothing much more than the original Amiga 1000's 86-pin connector, but internally. Alongside that, it was bundled with 1 MB of memory instead of the Amiga 1000's default 256K of RAM, and 512K of that sat on the motherboard itself, with the other 512K sat in that so-called MMU slot. So this meant that the original West German Amiga 2000 design had 512K of chip RAM, which was shared between the CPU, the Motorola 68000, and the Amiga's custom chips, and the other 512K sat in that MMU slot was actual fast RAM, not slow RAM, actual fast RAM. So the original Amiga 2000 from West Germany was ever so slightly faster than the original Amiga 1000, and for that matter, the Amiga 500. But this Amiga 2000 design was essentially a slightly beefed up Amiga 1000. All of the logic that controlled the expansion bus, the Zorro system and so forth, was all done in discrete logic. It wasn't put into one sort of little microcontroller. And so this design was quite expensive to produce. And also that video slot only really contained the Amiga's video signals that it otherwise output through the 23-pin RGB socket on the back of the machine, but internally. Now, obviously this means that you could plug a Genlock into that, which is great. You could put it on an internal card rather than being an external dongle device. But beyond that, it was the RGB port. So the original Amiga 2000 from West Germany was launched, and curiously, if you look in Amiga World, in their preview of the machine, you'll notice on the motherboard that it's silkscreen with Amiga 2500. Hang on a minute, we just talked about that one, and that one didn't come out until late 1988. So my hunch is that maybe originally the Amiga 2000, let's get it right. The Amiga 2000 would have been called the Amiga 2500, maybe to coincide with the Amiga 500 moniker, but more on that in its own episode. And the reason I think this is that if you look in the original Amiga 2000 hard disk controller, the A2090 manual, you'll see silkscreen on the little door, expansion card, the A2090 for Amiga 2500. So just putting that out there. I can't really find much other evidence of this, but it does seem to point somewhat towards this originally being called the Amiga 2500, but that name was dropped. So I guess it makes sense really in hindsight, doesn't it, for this to be the 2000. Anyway, so that's the West German Amiga 2000. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as A2000As, which is a little bit interesting. And yeah, that's really all I can say about this machine. But of course, Commodore being Commodore needed to cost reduce machines to make them more cost effective, because originally the Amiga 2000 was announced at a list price of $1,495, but when it was actually available, that price had risen to $1,995. But of course, obviously, dealers could offer discounts and that. Didn't include a monitor or anything like that. That was just for one floppy drive Amiga 2000 system. And obviously, as I was just talking about, some of them came with a hard disk controller, that A2090, and yeah, mostly with 40 megabyte hard drives, I believe. But anyway, that was the initial Amiga 2000. So the US engineering side of Commodore, which is where most of the engineering for the Amiga happened, in Westchester, Pennsylvania, looked at the West German Amiga design and realised that by taking some of the technology and changes that they had developed for the Amiga 500, they could cost reduce the Amiga 2000 quite significantly. And so Dave Haney, very famous Amiga engineer, set about integrating some of those innovations onto his version of the Amiga 2000. And so that included bringing things in like the fat Agnus chip rather than the thin Agnus, allowing 512k of chip RAM and so forth, and potentially up to 1 megabyte in the future. And also, he took all of that discrete logic that controlled the Zorro expansion bus and put it into a chip called Buster, the bus controller. And that made the expansion system of the Amiga 2000 much, much more stable. On top of that, he brought in the Gary Gate Array controller from the Amiga 500, which again reduced a lot of the Amiga 1000 derived discrete logic. Other changes were made to reduce the cost of the Amiga 2000 design, but essentially that was the so-called B2000CR, and the B2000 bit comes from its reference to the fact that a lot of it was derived from Amiga 500 ideas, and the Amiga 500's code name was B52. So that's why it's the B2000, not because it's alphabetically sequenced. But more on the B52 moniker in the Amiga 500 ranking video, whenever that comes. So, the B2000CR, CR standing for cost reduce, that is the vast bulk of Amiga 2000s that are out there. There are probably only about 60,000 of the original West German derived Amiga 2000 design out there. And yeah, they're fairly comparable, but there are differences. For example, that 1 megabyte of RAM is now fully integrated onto the Amiga 2000's or the B2000CR's motherboard. On top of this, Dave Haney made some changes to that video slot, and these would be quite important because instead of just having the Amiga's RGB signals as outputted by the 23-pin RGB connector internally, he also added some extra digital video lines to another expansion connector that was in line with the original one, and also added the parallel port signals so that maybe in the future somebody wanted to create, I don't know, say a linear video editing system, maybe on like a nice Zorro card perhaps, you know, switch between video sources. Maybe they could call their company something like, I don't know, Techno, something like that, and maybe they could create a card. They could call it something like the Video Breville. Yeah, the Video Breville. We'll call it the Video Breville, and basically that would be one of the world's first truly accessible broadcast quality desktop video editing systems, giving the Amiga a business case. It's a good idea, that. I just wonder if somebody could come up with that. The Techno Video Breville. Anyway, so this means that the product which I'm obviously referring to, the video toaster, is incompatible with the original West German Amiga 2000. Now I'm sure you can probably modify those systems. I've never actually personally seen that to expand that video expansion connector. But it does mean that really you want a B2000CR derived Amiga 2000 to use the video toaster. And of course the later Amiga 2500 and the Amiga 1500 both contain the full video slot that the B2000CR motherboards that's in those machines provides. So really, beyond that though, there aren't that many other differences between the original West German Amiga 2000 and the so-called B2000 CR. So yeah, if you buy an Amiga 2000 these days, more than likely it's going to be that American design. But please do check it out, because if you are looking to create a video toaster system, or potentially put a of the period retargetable graphics 24-bit graphics card into your Amiga 2000, which contains a flicker fixer solution, you may want to check inside and see whether you've got the full video expansion connector. But otherwise, an Amiga 2000 in its default configuration is very similar to an Amiga 500 really. It just has a lot more expansion potential internally. It runs the same processor, has the same initial memory expansion capability, that kind of thing. And the other mild differences that includes a real-time clock, and that's really important because if you do buy one of these, you want to see if there is any battery damage on the motherboard, because unfortunately the battery backed up clock, or the battery for that clock, is actually situated right next to the 68000 processor. So I just want to go back to that VRAM thought. The Ranger specification said that they were going to move graphics memory into VRAM. And this is important because, coincidental to the Amiga 2000's announcement in March of '87, two other machines were announced in the same month. One of those was only released in Japan, the Sharp X68000. That used VRAM for its graphics system, and that allowed many, almost if not arcade quality ports of games to its system, such as Strider and Street Fighter 2, for example. But also, probably a little bit more relevant, was the Macintosh 2 was also coincidentally announced in March of 1987. Now, aside from the fact that it actually contained a beefier processor in the form of the Motorola 68020, running at 14 MHz, which was a much faster processor than the original Amiga's Motorola 68000, it also included the option of a colour graphics card, bringing colour graphics to the Mac for the first time. And the high-end option was a 8-bit, that's 256 colour, 640 by 480 rock-steady flicker-free resolution, ideal for desktop publishing. Now obviously this cost an absolute fortune compared to an Amiga 2000 system, but still the potential was there, and the Amiga 2000 at the time it was launched did not have that capability. It could run a 16 colour screen in high resolution interlaced, but being interlaced it flickered like crazy. So combined with innovations such as the LaserJet or the laser writer printers, PostScript and Aldus not freehand, PageMaker, the Macintosh was really cementing its business case as a DTP system. But arguably until the video toaster came along, in the terms of business and so forth, the Amiga struggled to make a solid business case in a particular sector. Certainly companies did adopt the Amiga for various purposes before that, but it was the video toaster that really gave the Amiga a recognisable business case in a certain sector, in the way that DTP did for the Macintosh. So maybe Commodore was a little bit too confident on OCS, the original Amiga chipset, maintaining its lead. Already within 2 years or thereabouts of the original Amiga's launch, the competition was beginning to make inroads. And it could be argued that the Amiga OCS chipset was still a bit more powerful than that high-end Macintosh 2 colour graphics card, because the Amiga chipset had things like the copper, which will allow you to alter memory registers as the display has been drawn, allowing potentially for more colours on screen, and various other tricks involving multiplexing sprites for many sprites on screen, changing colours on the fly, and doing all sorts of other fantastic stuff, as well as the Amiga's really still quite cool 8-bit 4-channel audio system in Paula. So the Amiga still had a lot of sort of really good stuff in 1987, but that lead was going to get very quickly chipped away at beyond 1987. It's a shame that Commodore hadn't thought about that a bit more and taken the Ranger specification a bit more seriously, because it may have helped the Amiga maintain some of those graphic credentials going into 1988 and beyond. And of course, obviously, the flicker fixer, which got rid of those interlace screens and so forth, didn't make its way to the Amiga 2000 officially until the Amber card was released by Commodore in late 1990. a bit too late really, but there you have it. So yeah, I think whilst the Amiga 2500 made the ideal basis for a video toaster, I believe that a lot of credit has to go to the system that fundamentally the Amiga 2500 is, the Amiga 2000 here. So another little tidbit I just want to share with you is that a lot of you will know that after the original Amiga was released, R.J. Michael and Dave Needle went on to design a system for Epics, which went on to be called the Lynx. And many of you know, obviously Atari eventually, through various means, took that system on and released it commercially in 1989. Now, the Lynx paled in comparison to things such as the Game Boy. Obviously this is not an original Game Boy, this is the Game Boy Pocket. But it was developed by Dave Needle and R.J. Michael. And, basically, the interesting thing about that is that the development system for that recommended an Amiga 2000 because it had all the expansion capability, the potential for a hard disk and all the rest of it. And it led to the rather strange situation where Atari themselves had to purchase Commodore Amiga systems to develop for the Atari Lynx. Fancy that, huh? So the Amiga 2000 also had a little bit of minor history in that handheld gaming system. And another thing that I really should mention about the Amiga 2000, which I've neglected so far, is about the bridge board. And I think this is in part also why the West German Amiga 2000 design won out, because the original Amiga team were renowned for questioning why Commodore was investing money in the original Amiga sidecar, which provided an IBM XT compatible in a box that would sit alongside the original Amiga 1000 and allow for IBM PC compatibility. They were very much of the opinion like, well, it's an Amiga, it's got so many more advantages. Why would you spend all this time creating something that makes it basically a PC? It just doesn't make any sense. And actually, I agree with them. But one of the things that the West German team did work on was something called the bridge board. Now, those ISA expansion slots, which I talked about, that are in the Amiga 2000, by themselves don't do anything. You can't connect an ISA graphics card into an Amiga 2000 and install a driver and use that on your Amiga. It doesn't work like that. What you need is something called a bridge board. Now, Commodore made some, and other third parties did. In fact, I had a 386 Golden Gate 386SX card from my Amiga 3000 20 plus years ago. Fantastic little thing. But the idea of a bridge board is that it provides a PC essentially on a Zorro card that goes in the Amiga Zorro expansion system, but it also connects to the ISA bus that was on the Amigas. And what this allows it to do is not only can your Amiga now run IBM PC compatible software, but it also allows the bridge board to talk to those ISA expansion slots. So you can now, in fact, add, let's say, an ISA graphics card, a multi-serial port card, maybe a hard disk controller, these kinds of things into those ISA slots, and you've essentially got a PC inside your Amiga. But what makes this even more interesting, even in 2022 if you ask me, is that the Amiga side of things can communicate with the PC side of things, so it can share the Amiga's parallel port, serial port, the graphics, the floppy drive, the Amiga's hard disk, for example, and all of this just talks to each other. So you don't actually have to have a separate hard disk for your PC side of things, it just all talks together. And this was all coordinated by a piece of software called Janus, so named after the Roman deity, which is often depicted with two heads. And Janus is essentially the Roman god of new beginnings, gateways, yeah, essentially that kind of thing, like a gateway. And in fact, Janus is where we get the name of the month January from, like, it's a new start, new entry, new portal, that kind of meaning. I think that's right anyway. So yeah, so the bridge board was probably what Commodore thought, maybe that tips us more towards the West German design, and therefore the Amiga 2000 gets the go-ahead. But various bridge boards were developed, some with 8088 processors, so IBM XT class, and IBM AT286 class, and then finally, at least officially on the Commodore side of things, 386SX based bridge boards. There was a 486 bridge board, again also released by Golden Gate in the mid-90s, but it's a 486 SLC, I think it's called. Essentially, it's a bit like a 386 SX, so it's basically got like a 16-bit data bus, so it's got half of the throughput of a standard 486 processor. So yeah, it's not as fast as, not that a 486 is fast by modern standards, but it's not as fast as it may first seem. But anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. Bridge boards, still pretty funky bits of kit, you know, in 2022. You know, bit of a showpiece, shall we say, of look what my 1980s Amiga can do. But anyway, just wanted to mention that. Anyway, so do I recommend an Amiga 2000 these days? I think if you fall into the category of wanting to mess about with Music X, you know, doing MIDI sequencing, maybe doing a bit of Deluxe Paint, just messing around with some of the applications like SCADA, for example, and gaming, I really think an Amiga 2000 is a very big, bulky box. And the upgrades, you know, the vintage ones these are, can be quite expensive. And, you know, there's quite a lot of stuff that you have to get in order to really make the very most of an Amiga 2000 system. But on the plus side, and one of the reasons why I still think the Amiga 2000 potentially can be a good option if you do want that expansion potential, along with obviously creating a video toaster system, is that a lot of Amiga 500 upgrades that go into the 68000 socket are compatible with the Amiga 2000. So that includes everything from terrible fire cards to basic 68000 sockets, RAM expansions, for example, all the way up to vampire cards, for example. So the Amiga 2000 does have a lot of versatility there. So yeah, I think unless you're going to be looking to make use of those expansion slots or create a video toaster system, hand on the heart, I can't recommend the Amiga 2000 because it is a really big system. It's bigger than an Amiga 4000. These units are tanks. But otherwise, yeah, I feel the reason why it's higher up in this list is because it was the system that essentially made the video toaster possible, and that cannot be overlooked in the importance that that has in the Amiga's lore, shall we say. I feel that that is a big part of the Amiga's culture and what it contributed way beyond, you know, what the Amiga was to Amiga users back in the day. It's something that I talked about in the Amiga 2500 video in a little bit more length. So go and watch that video to find out what I have to say about the video toaster. But otherwise, yeah, that's it. We're now very much in that part of the Amiga ranking list where, you know, I'm talking about really good systems. And the Amiga 2000, I feel, yeah, does fall into that category. We're not talking about compromised systems necessarily. We're talking about Amigas that justified themselves in one way or another on the system and really contributed something to the culture of, you know, personal computing as a whole, I believe. We're talking a bit more than just being a mildly successful video games system based on CDs in late 1993 in the UK. We're moving into a slightly bigger realm of influence now. So this is why, for me, these systems are closer to the top of my list rather than the CD32s and CD-TVs of this world, because I feel that they made a bigger cultural impact than perhaps the Amiga 500 Plus did. I'm sure for many people, the Amiga 500 Plus, with its Cartoon Classics pack, for example, gave many of us very fun times playing on Lemmings and D-Paint and all this kind of stuff. But culturally, I feel that the Amiga 2000 was more important because it made things like the video toaster possible. So, what did you think? Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? Throw it all down in the comments as usual. I'd love to read what you've got to say. But other than that, I think that's it. Today is a good day because I can finally do this. And I'm sure we can all agree that that is an improvement. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I guess that all remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace! Ugh. Hell yeah. Can I skate? Shouldn't do this, but hey, what? Woo! Hell yeah.